The conquest of Joshua is one of the most controversial topics in the Bible. It records that after the exodus from Egypt, Israel moved into the land of Canaan and conquered large areas of territory. Many scholars doubt this event occurred, but in the past few decades, that has been changing. More and more evidence is coming out that the conquest may have an historical basis, and there might be sufficient evidence to suggest that some form of conquest may have occurred at the end of the Late Bronze Age. The story of the conquest is as follows. After being sentenced to wander in the desert for 40 years, the children of Israel moved into Canaan to take control of the region. They first encountered a walled fortress called Jericho. They sent spies in and were aided by a prostitute that lived in a section of the wall. After a miraculous earthquake attributed to God, the walls of Jericho fell. The fortress was taken and burned by the Israelites. They then moved into the area of Bethel and tried to take a small town called Ai. After an initial failed attempt, Ai was burned. Then Joshua built an altar to God on Mount Ebal. The Israelites were then victorious in a battle against 5 armies of the Amorites. This allowed them to move south into Canaan and capture a large region of the territory and all the cities therein. Israel then turned north and defeated a coalition of Canaanite armies, but the record states they only burned the city of Hazor. Then Joshua 13 records that large areas of Canaan remained to be conquered, but we find out later the conquest was never completed. Israel assembled at Shiloh, divided up the land among the tribes, and all went to their own conquered regions. A long time afterwards, Joshua was advanced in years and close to death. He assembled Israel at Shechem to warn them not to follow after the gods of the Canaanites that still lived among them. They then set up a large stone at Shechem to be a sign of their covenant with God. Thus Israel's exodus from Egypt and the conquest of Canaan had ended. As we noted in Exodus Rediscovered, Israel likely left Egypt around 1265 BCE, so they would have arrived in Canaan around 1225 BCE, which was just before the end of the Bronze Age and is a period known as the Late Bronze Age 2B. Richard Hess says the events of Joshua 1-12 likely took place over a period of about 5 years. But many people argue we have no evidence a conquest happened in this period, because there's no evidence most of the cities mentioned in the book of Joshua were destroyed at this time. But the problem with this objection is that the book of Joshua does not state most of the cities that were captured by Israel were burned or destroyed. The language indicates they took these regions without burning or utterly destroying most of the cities and towns. Joshua 11:13-14 even notes, the only city that was burned in the north was Hazor. The rest were taken as plunder. Numerous times the Bible indicates Israel was not going to destroy the cities within Canaan, but remove the inhabitants and claim the land and cities for their own. In fact, this policy in the book of Joshua matches the Egyptian policy of conquest. Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen says, first, as we have seen, the text of Joshua does not imply huge and massive fiery destructions of every site visited. Only Jericho, Ai, and Hazor were burned. The Egyptians did not usually burn cities, preferring to make them into profitable tax-paying vassals. The Hebrews under Joshua sought basically to kill off the Canaanite leadership and manpower to facilitate late occupation. So despite what skeptics claim, we should not expect to find that most of the cities in Canaan were destroyed at the end of the Late Bronze Age, if the book of Joshua is true. If we did find that, it would actually be inconsistent with the biblical account. Instead, Joshua's conquest is recorded to have happened in a way that is consistent with the Egyptian policy of conquest, and thereby consistent with the cultural context of the time. The only places that Joshua explicitly says were destroyed were Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. A city like Bethel may have also been destroyed, given its relation with Ai. Now, the archaeological site of Jericho has been controversial for decades. When John Garstang first excavated the site, he suggested Jericho was destroyed in the 15th century BCE. This made many early Exodus date proponents excited, and to this day, many still claim it as evidence of Joshua's conquest. But later on, Kathleen Kenyon pushed the date of this destruction that Garstang found back to around 1550 BCE, which was way too early to align with the early date for the Exodus. Early Exodus date proponents have attempted to argue that Kenyon was wrong to push the destruction layer back to 1550 BCE, but have had little success in convincing most archaeologists. Others have attempted to rework the ancient chronology so this destruction layer fits with Joshua's conquest. But all of this is probably a waste of time. The 1550 BCE destruction has features which suggest it could not have been the destruction mentioned in the book of Joshua. At this time, Jericho lacked casemate walls, and casemate walls are described in the biblical account. Instead, this early destruction had a cyclopean wall, which was a single wall of boulders that supported fill piled on top. Whereas casemate walls were double-walled structures that surrounded a city. The outer wall was fortified, and there was a second inner wall. Between the two walls were residential buildings. Casemate walls, built from mud bricks, began to appear in the Late Bronze Age and faded out of style in the Iron Age. And what we need to remember is the account in Joshua describes a casemate wall around Jericho, because it says Rahab's house was in the city wall. So if the early destruction of Jericho that occurred in the Middle Bronze Age lacked casemate walls, it could not have been the biblical destruction of Jericho. Additionally, this early destruction also displayed evidence the city was sieged with battering rams. The biblical destruction was caused by an earthquake, and Israel did not need to use battering rams. So even if this destruction could be redated, it would still not fit with the biblical account. So we need to look for a later time when Jericho was destroyed. Many people are not aware of this, but Garstang actually suggested there may have been a second destruction that occurred later in the Late Bronze Age. He identified another structure called the Middle Building, which was built over top the earlier destruction layer and had its own later destruction layer. Additional evidence from the site of Jericho, like tombs that dated to the period of the Late Bronze Age, did suggest the site was still occupied after the 1550 BCE destruction. In the past, others suggested there may have been a second destruction around 1400 BCE, but such a hypothesis has lacked evidence. However, all that changed recently when the latest reports on Jericho were released, which shed some light on the situation. Further excavations have revealed the site was occupied on a reduced scale after 1550 BCE and during the Late Bronze Age. Archaeologist Lorenzo Nigro notes, the burnt and collapsed Middle Bronze III defensive system was refurbished by adding a mud brick wall on top of the surviving crest of the Cyclopean wall. So the site was occupied and a new mud brick wall was built. But the reason prior excavations have not found evidence of occupation during this time period was due to site leveling of later occupants. Late Bronze 2B layers were heavily cut by leveling operations carried out in the Iron Age, and this explains the scarcity of 13th century material. The overall stratigraphy of Tel Es Sultan through time may explain why Late Bronze Age layers were mostly preserved all around the Tel on its flanks, but were almost completely cut away from its top by Iron Age, Roman, Hellenistic, and Byzantine building activities. In other words, during the Iron Age, Roman, and Byzantine periods, the occupants cut into the Late Bronze Age layers when they were building on top of the site, thereby removing those layers for archaeologists to later find. It is not that there is no evidence of a destruction at Jericho during the 13th century, it's that the layers, which would reveal evidence of a destruction, or show there was never a destruction, were cut away by later builders. But the new findings still suggested the site was occupied up until the Late Bronze Age 2B, which as we noted is the period between 1300 and 1200 BCE. There was no evidence of a second destruction around 1400 BCE. However, a change seems to have occurred after the Late Bronze Age 2B, where the mud brick fortified city was replaced by a small town. To quote, Iron Age 1 was detected only in a few places on Spring Hill. Diagnostic ceramic material was dated to the 11th century BC and may be related to a rural village that rose over the ruins of the late Bronze City. So even though what we were able to find has been limited due to site leveling, there is some evidence that at some point in the late Bronze Age 2B, or at the beginning of the Iron Age, Jericho went from a fortified city to a small town. More work on the site needs to be done, but what has recently been published does seem to fit with the biblical account. In the late Bronze Age, there was a fortified city, and then after this period, the site only had a small town, which fits with the biblical account, because after the Conquest, Jericho was referred to as the City of Palms and still had occupants, but Judges implies it lacked the same fortified structures. Either way, despite what many skeptics have claimed, the archaeological data does not contradict the biblical account when it comes to Jericho. And when we look at other sites, we will see there is more evidence that confirms the biblical account in the late date for the Conquest. But skeptics also bring up the site of Ai, and claim that there was no evidence of a destruction during the late Bronze Age. Many argue Ai has been identified with the site of ALLthat, which was destroyed in the early Bronze Age, but there is no evidence the whole site was rebuilt and destroyed again at the end of the late Bronze Age. But we need to look at what the biblical account says about this site. For one, the name Ai itself might be revealing. Ai means ruin or a heap of stones, and it is called that before Joshua destroyed the site, which could imply that Israel was aware the site was a place of ruins before Joshua. The book of Joshua also doesn't treat the site of Ai like a fortified city with walls. There are no walls of Ai mentioned in the text. In fact, it contrasts the small site of Ai with Gibeon, which was said to be a great city. Joshua 7:3 even says the men of Ai were few. Only 3 units of fighting men were sent. Remember, as we noted in Exodus Rediscovered, the word we translate as 1,000 can also mean a unit, tribe, or a group. It does not necessarily mean Joshua sent 3,000 men. Joshua 8 also says when Israel faked a retreat, all the men of Ai and Bethel chased after them. Kenneth Kitchen suggests Ai may have been a small outpost for Bethel, not a large walled city. So due to all this, we should not expect to find a major destruction of Ai at this time, like what occurred in the early Bronze Age. But this also means finding evidence of a small destruction would be hard to find. First, Kitchen notes ALLthat has not been fully excavated, or may not even be the proper site. There is evidence the site of Bethel nearby was destroyed at this time, which Israel Finkelstein attributes to the Israelites. And this destruction might be implied in the book of Joshua, since there's an indication the Israelites were at war with the men of Ai and Bethel. So given this, it's possible that both sites were destroyed together, even though Ai is only mentioned. But we must remember, of the thousands of sites that have been found in the region, only about 60% have been surveyed, less than 2 have been partially excavated, whereas most sites have not been fully excavated. And then only a fraction of what has been excavated has even been published. So it's not like we have fully excavated the region and know a small outpost could not have been destroyed. Additionally, we do not know about the housing structures that compose the site of Ai. If the site lacked walls, it likely also lacked stone or brick houses, or any features that would have left discernible evidence for thousands of years later, after millennia of erosion and intrusion by later occupants. Essentially, the small site of Ai and the unknown characteristics of the site, including the uncertainty of the identification of it, are not enough to create a problem for the biblical account. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But after this, it records Joshua built an altar on Mount Ebal for God. In the 1980s, a small square structure with a stone circle and a rectangular floor was discovered that dates to a period of 1240 to 1200 BCE. In the following stratum, more structures were built around this earlier structure. There was also a place where ash and animal bones seemed to have been stored. Analysis of the bones at the site revealed remains of bulls, sheep, goats, and deer that were burned in open flames of low temperatures. Adam Zertal, who excavated the site, became convinced and stated, "Beyond question, our site is a cultic center." Some have suggested it may have been a watchtower, and this is possible, but unlikely, given the view from where the structure was found was limited. One cannot see the full road from Shechem. Additionally, The archaeologists working on the site suggested the structure resembled a solid-state equivalent of the altar of the tabernacle, and very well may be the site that Joshua was commanded to build. Ralph K. Hawkins remarked, "When all the data are taken together, it seems to me that the Iron Age 1 structure on Mount Ebal is very likely to have been the site that lay behind the traditions contained in Joshua 8:30-35. Ann E. Killebrew even remarked, "The emerging consensus tends to support the cultic interpretation of this early Iron 1 site." Thus, given the data, it seems the site on Mount Ebal better fits with what is recorded in Joshua 8, and therefore would confirm that Joshua did in fact build an altar to God on Mount Ebal. Once Joshua had victory in the south, he then turned his attention north to Hazor. The site of Hazor was identified in the 19th century and is virtually undisputed today. The archaeological data of the site aligns incredibly well with the biblical account. Joshua treats Hazor as the head of the northern kingdoms. The archaeological evidence indicates Hazor may very well have been one of the largest cities in Canaan in its day, comprising a total of 210 acres, with 30 acres comprising the upper city. More importantly, archaeologists also agree at the end of the Late Bronze Age, Hazor was destroyed by fire. Excavation director of Hazor, Amon Ben Tor, said, "A fierce conflagration marked the end of Canaanite Hazor. Across the site, a thick layer of ashes and charred wood, in places 3 feet deep, attests to the intensity of the blaze in the northern Galilee city. Within the walls of Hazor's palace, the fire was especially fierce. The unusual amount of timber used in the construction of the building, and the large quantity of oil stored, in huge pithoi storage jars, throughout the palace, proved a fatal combination, creating an inferno with temperatures exceeding 2,350 degrees Fahrenheit. In this intense heat, the palace's mud brick walls vitrified, basalt slabs cracked, and clay vessels melted." Archaeologist Yigael Yadin, who directed excavations on the site in the past, became convinced the destruction at the end of the Late Bronze Age was the work of Joshua. He dated the destruction to around 1230 BCE. Ben Tor says this is overconfident, and says the destruction had to happen sometime between 1250 and 1200 BCE, which is the exact time we would expect to find Israel there to burn the city. Another key feature at Hazor that points to Israel's conquest is that the idols at Hazor were mutilated in a fashion that matches Israelite practices. Whoever burned the city also deliberately destroyed statuary in the palace. Among the ashes, we discovered the largest Canaanite statue of human form ever found in Israel, carved from a basalt block that must have weighed more than a ton. The 3-foot-tall statue had been smashed into nearly 100 pieces, which were scattered in a 6-foot-wide circle. The head and hands of this statue, and of several others, were missing, apparently cut off by the city's conquerors. Ben Tor notes only 4 groups could have destroyed Hazor. The first 2 possibilities are a Canaanite group or an Egyptian group. The problem is the statues at Hazor depicted Egyptian kings and gods, and it's extremely unlikely they would have destroyed their own idols. Another possibility is the Philistines, or another group of the Sea People. But Hazor was too far inland to be of any interest to them, and there's no evidence of any Sea Peoples at the site. So to quote Ben Tor, this leaves us with the Israelites, which fits with the destruction of the idols at Hazor. In other words, the archaeological data there matches the biblical account and confirms Hazor was destroyed, as Joshua records. Early day proponents attempt to argue this cannot be the biblical destruction of Joshua, and it needs to be a later destruction that occurred during the time of the Judges, when Deborah and Barak fought against the later king of Hazor. In other words, early day proponents claim Hazor was destroyed twice, once during Joshua's conquest, and once later during the time of Judges. So the last destruction, which occurred at the end of the Late Bronze Age, should align with the time of the Judges, and Joshua's conquest must have happened before this. The problem with this reasoning is Judges does not record that Hazor was burned or destroyed during the days of Deborah. It only says Israel defeated the armies from Hazor and gained their independence. So early day proponents are incorrect when they state the biblical record should indicate Hazor was destroyed twice. Richard Hess notes, after the destruction of Hazor around 1220 BCE, The following strata indicates the site was still occupied, although without walls, and therefore would align with the Book of Judges, where Hazor again became a great city that was able to send armies to oppress Israel. So the archaeological data better aligns with the theory that Israel's conquest happened in the 13th century BCE, since the Book of Judges does not state Hazor was burned a second time. After the destruction of Hazor, Israel took control of the north, and then met at Shiloh, which would have been considered a cultic site. Evidence from the site reveals it was treated as cultic at the beginning of the Late Bronze Age, long before Israel's arrival. Use of the site decreased and eventually ceased sometime during the Late Bronze Age. But then at the beginning of the Iron Age, the evidence indicates the site was resettled with distinct Israelite features. Finkelstein says, "These are the most important building remains of Iron I Shiloh, indicating developed construction techniques and archaeological concepts already at this early stage of Israelite settlement." The excavation results shed light on several aspects concerning the role of Shiloh in the Israelite settlement process. First, it is now clear that in the beginning of the Iron Age, Shiloh was the outstanding candidate to become the sacred center of the hill country population, since it was an ancient cult site that now stood deserted in an area with only sparse Canaanite population and a high concentration of Israelite sites. Due to erosion at the site, we're not entirely sure of the exact time when Shiloh was first resettled by the Israelites, but Israelite building features did not begin to appear until the beginning of the Iron Age, indicating it was likely settled shortly before this, but not until after the period when the site ceased being used by earlier Canaanites in the Late Bronze Age. And although we cannot pinpoint an exact date, this period would also align with the time of the conquest in the 13th century BCE. North of Shiloh was the important site of Shechem. Shechem is not listed as a conquered city in Joshua, which seems to indicate there was a peaceful takeover by Israel. In the prior century, Shechem was the base of a Canaanite rebel named Labayu. The Egyptians eventually sent troops to kill him, and after that Shechem did not rise to its former glory. When Israel later moved in, they seem to have been peacefully accepted by the local Shechemites. The archaeological data supports this, showing no signs of a destruction at this time. There was also found at the site a sanctuary, altar, and a large standing stone, which correlates to Joshua 24, of Joshua setting up a standing stone. We're unable to date when the stone was placed in this spot, so when it comes to Shechem, we can at least say there is nothing inconsistent with the biblical account, and the data seems to align nicely. Additionally, between Kurt Van Beckham and Kenneth Kitchen, over 24 sites mentioned in Joshua have been identified and fit with the account in Joshua, which states these sites existed at the time. Van Beckham says, "The overall pattern is quite positive, in particular in comparison with the corroborations between archaeological excavations and the Egyptian New Kingdom texts describing Asiatic campaigns." Kenneth Kitchen says, "Looking back over these 20 entries, omitting places whose identification on the ground is doubtful, or which have not yet been explored archaeologically, we find that 18 or 19 of them were in being in Late Bronze II, and one, Hebron, had tombs used then of people who lived there, leaving only Makeda without direct evidence, and most of that site is not accessible, hence it is not decisive. This is a very good score by any standard." As we've noted, millennia of erosion does remove a lot of the evidence, but even with this fact, we're still able to identify dozens of sites mentioned in Joshua that were in existence at the end of the Late Bronze Age. Thus, the description of the region in Joshua fits well with the archaeological data. Some skeptics might attempt to bring up the site of Gibeon, because excavations didn't reveal the site was occupied in the Late Bronze Age. But the site is still 95% unexcavated. James Pritchard, who excavated the site, did find evidence of imported goods as far as Cyprus and Egypt, scarabs bearing the name of 18th dynasty pharaohs, and Late Bronze Age tombs that appear quite sophisticated. A campaign report of Amenhotep II also mentions that he captured Karu, or Horites, a term associated with the Hivites, which appears in Joshua 9:7. So since Gibeon is nowhere near fully excavated, and there are some indications there were occupants there in the Late Bronze Age, Gibeon is not much of an issue as of now. So far, We've only talked about the sites mentioned in the biblical account, and have been able to show correlations. But what reasons do we have to connect all this data with the Exodus and Conquest? In other words, how do we know these events were caused by Israel, and not different groups in different events? Well, there is additional circumstantial evidence that points to Israel being in Canaan at this point, and being the cause of the new sites, like Ebal and Shiloh, and destroying places like Hazor. First off, it is well known that Merneptah Stele says Israel was in Canaan at this point, and there's no indication they were there prior to this. So at this time, when the archaeological correlations with the book of Joshua are happening, Egypt attests to Israel being present in Canaan. So we have multiple attestation that Israel was in Canaan at this time, since the book of Joshua and the Merneptah Stele mention them present in Canaan. Second, we also see a drastic change between the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. There was a sudden population explosion that occurred in Canaan right after Israel's conquest would have occurred. Archaeologist Mei Mazor puts it like this: intensive archaeological surface surveys revealed an entirely new settlement pattern in Iron Age 1. Hundreds of new small sites were inhabited in the mountainous areas of the Upper and Lower Galilee, in the hills of Samaria and Ephraim and Benjamin, and the northern Negev, and in parts of central and northern Transjordan. Much of this activity can be related to Israelite tribes, though the ethnic attribution in some of these regions is still questionable. Even though not every area has been excavated, what we can identify is that the Ephraim-Samaria region registered only about a dozen sites in the Late Bronze Age. But then at the beginning of the Iron Age, we see no fewer than 131 occupied sites. In West Manasseh, there were only about 30 sites in the Late Bronze Age, then over 200 in Iron 1. Two-thirds of these sites were entirely new, and we do not see such a large increase earlier back in the Late Bronze Age, when the early Exodus Day proponents claim the conquest happened. We only see this at the end of the Late Bronze Age. Even William Dever admits, the new Israelite settlements are almost all founded de novo, not on the ruins of destroyed Late Bronze Age sites, but in the sparsely populated hill country extending from Upper and Lower Galilee into the hills of Samaria and Judah, and southward into the northern Negev. The reason archaeologists identify these as early Israelite sites is because this is the same culture that eventually becomes the culture of the later Israelite monarchy and then the divided monarchy period. The material culture of Israel traces back to these Iron Age 1 sites, and interestingly enough, they do not appear to go back any further. We also see there were new styles in pottery and new agricultural techniques, but more importantly, we also see a shift in faunal remains. In Iron Age 1 sites, we find more remains of sheep and goats and a sudden lack of pig bones around these sites in the Judean hill country. Even though we still find pig bones closer to the coast among Philistine sites and in the highland country prior to this period. Baruch Halpern says, prior to and during the Sea People's settlement, Canaanite sites reveal low levels, but real levels, of pig consumption. The early Philistine layers conversely indicate a very high level of pig consumption, but the Israelite sites of the highlands disclose an almost complete absence of pig, showing in addition a general preference for sheep over goat. Given the data, it seems clear the influx of new settlements is without a doubt the early Israelites. As Lawrence Stagger said, that many of these villages belong to pre-monarchic Israel is beyond doubt. Scholars like William Dever and Israel Finkelstein do not believe these people came from outside of Israel, but came from the lowlands within Canaan. After many cities were destroyed at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, they argue the Canaanites became pastoral nomads for a few centuries, before resettling in the highlands and becoming the tribes of Israel. Kenneth Kitchen notes there are numerous problems with this theory, and that the data is better explained by positing a conquest and an influx of new people into the region. First off, the sudden population growth from the end of the Late Bronze Age to the Iron Age is massive. It is roughly a 5-fold increase. It seems ad hoc to posit this group was already in Canaan and living as pastoral nomads, invisible to any archaeological detection. It makes more sense to suggest this was a result of a sudden influx of new people. And we have an historical testimony, the book of Joshua, that attest to this happening, which also accounts for the new sites like Shiloh and Ebal, and the destruction at Hazor and the change at Jericho. And we do not have an historical testimony that claims Israel began as a large group of pastoral nomads of Canaan and then just moved into the highlands. So why posit a hypothesis with no historical witness over another that has an historical witness that is already attested by Israel in their own texts as their origin story? The theory Israel arose as an indigenous Canaanite population moving into the highlands also fails to account why there was a sudden lack of pig bones and a shift to using more sheep and goats. Kitchen also notes if this was an attempt for the Canaanites to move into the highlands to avoid the Egyptian tax collectors. The tax collectors would simply have followed them and taxed their cattle instead of their erstwhile crops. So it seems more likely the large new population of the Iron Age 1 was the result of an influx of outsiders, rather than being a change that occurred within Canaan. And this is what the textual evidence of Joshua suggests. Finally, we can add one additional piece of data to support the conquest, which is the Deir Allah inscription. The text is highly fragmented and dates to the end of the 9th century BCE, but it does attest to a non-Israelite prophet called Balaam, son of Beor, who was a seer for the gods and spoke of a coming apocalyptic event. This is not the prophecy that is described in the book of Numbers, but it does support the biblical account, which states there was a prophet named Balaam in that region who worshipped other gods. All in all, there is a lot in the archaeological record that confirms or correlates to what we read in the biblical account. Some have argued an Israelite conquest could not have occurred at the end of the Bronze Age, because Egypt controlled Canaan. So why would Israel leave Egypt, only to return to territory controlled by Egypt? This is a misunderstanding of Egypt's presence in Canaan. Egypt ruled over Canaan from a distance. The Egyptians really didn't have an empire, but a hegemony over Canaan. Egypt set up small garrisons throughout Canaan of less than 1,000 people. These garrisons were primarily used for collecting tribute and supporting the pharaoh when he went on a campaign. They didn't rule over Canaan in the same way Rome or Persia did in later periods. The Canaanite cities were vassals of Egypt and paid tribute, but they were never considered part of mainland Egypt. Furthermore, during the time of the conquest, Egyptian hegemony was waning, and they had lost their former glory and control over Canaan. While Israel took control of the Judean foothills, the Sea Peoples conquered the coastal regions of Canaan, and shortly after, attempted to invade Egypt. The same conditions that allowed for the Sea Peoples' invasion also allowed for the Israelites to take the Judean foothills. Baruch Halpern says, "The Sea Peoples' bridgehead was simply too broad and successful, and the Egyptian Empire too fragile to withstand the collapse of the coastal trade. For a time, before Ramesses III, as he himself relates, Egypt was no longer in a condition to project power beyond its borders. According to his autobiography, it was even dominated by Canaanite chieftain, probably in the Delta." The significance of this is if Egypt was not strong enough to prevent the Sea Peoples' invasion, they would also not have been able to prevent an Israelite conquest from the east. In order for the Egyptians to have reached Israel, they would have had to have traveled north via the coastal plain, and then travel south into the Judean foothills. So it would have been strange for Egypt to have been strong enough to prevent an Israelite invasion, but not strong enough to prevent a Philistine invasion that was much closer to the Egyptian mainland. So Israel's conquest fits extremely well with the events that occurred at the end of the Bronze Age. New people groups moved into Canaan, conquered large sections of territory, all while the Egyptian power and military might was on the decline. But is there any good internal evidence within the book of Joshua that aligns with the external evidence that there was a conquest in Canaan? Well, there are good reasons to suggest what we read is a reliable account of how Israel entered Canaan. As we've already noted, Kenneth Kitchen notes Joshua's strategy of conquest, of taking over towns and cities instead of utterly destroying them, is consistent with the ancient cultural context, as this was the standard Egyptian policy. Additionally, in Joshua 15:9 and 18:15, it mentions a place called the Springs of the Waters of Neptah, which is in a mountainous region. Kitchen says this location is best understood as a spring of Merneptah, which is identified in Egyptian texts. Egyptian texts speak of the troop commanders of the wells of Merneptah that are in the mountain range. So it seems both Joshua and Egyptian texts identify the same spring in a mountainous region and by the same name. When the Israelites first entered the land, the text implies a series of earthquakes occurred. One was said to temporarily stop the flow of the Jordan River so Israel could cross over. This was said to have occurred upriver by a town called Adam. This site has been identified, and interestingly enough, at the same site it has been shown today that the high banks there have been liable to periodic collapses that are sufficient to block up the river. This was said to occur in 1267 AD, 1906, and during an earthquake of 1927. Joshua's account of the Jordan being blocked up by the town of Adam fits with the geography of the region. Many of the people groups in Joshua also have cognates found in other ancient texts. The biblical Hivites are likely identified with the Hurrians. The Perizzites also might have a cognate found in other texts. Girgashites is directly comparable with a name found in Ugaritic administrative texts. Districts of Mount Seir, Edomites, and Moab are mentioned as existing at this time in Egyptian texts. Individual names in Joshua can also be found in other texts from the same era. Rahab resembles another West Semitic name. Japhi of Laish is likely the name Yapia. The name Jabin has been found in the Mari archives. Horam of Gezer is likely the West Semitic name Haran. And many other names in Joshua also appear in 2nd millennium texts. Thus we are not dealing with made-up names, or names that only fit with the 1st millennium BCE, but names that fit well with the culture of the 2nd millennium. The list of items stolen by Achan also correlates well with the 2nd millennium BCE. It records he took a beautiful cloak from Shinar, and 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels. Babylonia exported garments throughout the ancient Near East, including Canaan. The phrase for the gold bar, or tongue, as it appears in Joshua, appears the same way in one of the Amarna letters from the 14th century BCE. Both follow the same word order: ingot, gold, number, shekels, weight. Richard Hess says, "These two items in particular make this parallel unique. They suggest that the list betrays signs of an origin in the 2nd millennium BC. Hess also notes the section in Joshua on land grants is very similar in structure to 18th century BC grant of the city of ALLlhat and its environs from Abiel, king of Aleppo. Both begin with a narrative background and circumstances leading to the gift of land, then followed by allotments, question of sacrifice as part of the gift, repeated stipulations for loyalty and warning of disobedience, and concluding with witnesses and oaths of reinforcement." Thus, given all this data, Richard Hess can say, one can notice the 2nd millennium context for descriptions surrounding the Jericho story: personal and people group names, items stolen by Achan, boundary lists, the vassal treaty structure of Joshua 24, and other items. All of these argue for an antiquity and an authenticity to the book of Joshua as set within the late 2nd millennium BC, perhaps around 1200 BC. The overall structure of how Joshua was written fits with the cultural context as well. In the first part of Joshua, we have long accounts. Then when reporting the rest of Joshua's conquest, the later events are mentioned in much briefer sections. We can find similar structure in Egyptian texts. Kitchen says, "Most striking is the example of the campaign annals of Tutmosis III of Egypt, in his years 22 to 42. As others have noted, the pharaoh there gives a very full account of his initial victory at Megiddo, by contrast with the far more summary and stylized reports of the ensuing 16 subsequent campaigns. Just like Joshua, against up to 7 kings in South Canaan, and 4 plus up north, final total of 31. The pharaoh faced a hostile alliance, the rulers of Kadesh and Megiddo, plus 330 allied kinglets. We find a similar structure in the account of a Hittite king. And in Amarna letters 185 and 186, we find similar literary formulas to what we see in Joshua. The victorious long lists of conquered towns and geographical groupings also appears in other war annals. K. Lawson Younger Jr. said, "While there are differences, the Hebrew conquest account of Canaan in Joshua 9 to 12 is by and large typical of any ancient Near Eastern account. Some insist on reading the triumphant accounts in Joshua as entirely literal, meaning Joshua reports every single person in these regions was killed and none were left alive that breathed. But this seems to be misunderstanding the cultural context of rhetorical summarizations. Tutmosis III boasted in his military campaigns that he totally annihilated the armies of Mitanni, making them non-existent. But we do not think he literally killed every soldier. We understand this as hyperbole, since in later texts we read the forces of Mitanni were still in existence. Merneptah claimed, Canaan has been plundered into every sort of woe, Ashkelon has been overcome, Gezer has been captured, Yanoam is made non-existent, Israel is laid waste, his seed is not, Huru has become a widow because of Egypt. This is obvious exaggeration. Mesha, the king of Moab, boasted that Israel has utterly perished for always. But it would be absurd to take this as literally true, since after Israel's war with Moab, Israel still existed. See, the book of Joshua uses very similar language to what we see in other ancient Near Eastern texts of war, where the other side is spoken of as totally annihilated or exterminated. But this seems to be ancient Near Eastern hyperbole. Joshua 10:20 says the armies of the Amorites were wiped out, but then follows this with mentioning a remnant of soldiers. Nicholas Wolterstorff suggests the conquest of Joshua needs to be understood as hagiographic hyperbole, and this type of language fits with the cultural context of war annals of that time period. K. Lawson Younger Jr. said many scholars fail to recognize the hyperbolic nature of the account in Joshua, and this became clear once compared to the hyperbolic nature of other ancient Near Eastern accounts of complete conquest. Zioni Zevit said, when the composition and rhetoric of the Joshua narratives in chapters 9 to 12 are compared to the conventions of writings about the conquest in Egyptian, Hittite, Akkadian, Moabite, and Aramaic texts, they are revealed to be very similar. Thus, given all this data, Joshua seems to fit as an ancient Near Eastern war annal. Kenneth Kitchen says, this was how military reports were customarily written, and these structures and others are the most common coin of the second millennium already, long before Neo-Assyrian times. So now, let's write out all the data we have covered that supports the Exodus and Conquest. Genesis indicates Jacob and his family settled in and around the city of Avaris, which the Bible calls the land of Goshen. We see there was a Semitic population around there, and some were shepherds. Later on, Exodus indicates the Hebrews were enslaved in Egypt after a dynasty change and forced to make bricks. When the 15th dynasty fell to the 18th dynasty, the population of Avaris was enslaved and treated harshly. We have evidence that foreign slaves were involved in brickmaking in Egypt, and no pig bones were found at the site of Avaris, where the Hebrews would have resided. But there appears to have been several shepherds of sheep and goats. The population of Avaris remained there for generations, and then during the Ramesside period, the city was abandoned, and the native Egyptians used the site as a cemetery. However, roughly one generation later, or around 40 years, there was a population boom in Canaan. Dozens of new sites show up and are considered the beginning of the early Israelite material culture. The Merneptah Stela also explicitly says Israel was in Canaan at this point. The sites also begin a new trend in the Highland region, which is a pig taboo. So no pig bones were found at these Iron Age sites. But a lot of sheep and goat remains were found, which was also the case earlier at Avaris in Egypt. The site of Shiloh is resettled with distinct Israelite features, a site on Mount Ebal is created that fits with the account in Joshua. Additionally, the archaeology at Shechem aligns with the biblical account as well, and roughly 24 or more cities and towns in Joshua fit with the archaeological record. At this time, Hazor is destroyed with fire, which aligns with the account in Joshua and Israelite practices of destroying idols. The new data at the site of Jericho also indicates there was a mud brick fortified structure that transitioned to a small town. And the Dir Allah inscription confirms there was a non-Israelite prophet in the region named Balaam son of Beor. When we combine all this data, it seems there is more than enough sufficient evidence to confirm Israel's exodus from Egypt and conquest in Canaan at the end of the Late Bronze Age. But additionally, we have a wealth of internal clues within the biblical texts that support the Exodus account, and do not support the theory the story of the Exodus is the work of later mythmakers. There is an abundance of Egyptian loanwords in the Exodus narrative that makes more sense with the theory the people that wrote the account came from Egypt or an Egyptian culture. Many of the names of Joshua and the Pentateuch make more sense in the 2nd millennium BCE, and many align with Egyptian names. The toponyms in Exodus fit best with the Ramesside period, and the toponym Ramesses was no longer in use in later times. The account in Exodus 14 to 15 matches the structure and motifs of the Kadesh inscription, and fits with an Egyptian style of writing from that specific time period. The Ark of the Covenant is strikingly similar to Egyptian cultic furniture, and fits with the styles we see from the Ramesside period. The altar of the tabernacle, the turquoise gemstone and the high priest's breastplate, and the overall design of the tabernacle and priest attire fits with Egyptian religious customs. The Exodus account was not written in a mythological fashion and is multiply attested in Israelite sources. Exodus has knowledge of Egyptian customs, crop cycles, and displays Egyptian literary themes. Even the way Israel encamped matches how Ramesses II encamped with his army. The Israelite religious festivals fit with dates, descriptions, and practices of other competing religious festivals in the Levant from the Late Bronze Age. The formations of the covenant between God and Israel fit more with Hittite treaties from the Bronze Age than with later treaties of the Iron Age. In Dilbert Hiller's notes, these types of treaties invoke historical events to encourage the vassal state hold to the treaty. In Joshua, a specific spring is identified that matches a spring in Egyptian texts from the same time period. The description of the Jordan River stopping matches the geology of the region. Many of the people groups in Joshua fit with the culture of the Late Bronze Age. The items stolen at Jericho also fit with the culture of that time period. Israel dividing up land grants fits with another text from the second millennium, and the account also fits with Egyptian strategies for conquering regions and the structure and language of ancient Near Eastern war annals. Therefore, given all the external and internal evidence, why do some skeptics still insist there is no evidence to conclude an Exodus and Conquest event happened as the origin of the nation of Israel? Skeptics often highlight some of these facts and say these alone would not be enough to confirm an Exodus event, which is true. If we only had a few of these data points, the historical case for the Exodus would be insufficient. But what we actually have is an embarrassment of riches when it comes to evidence for the Exodus. So why create an alternative theory for the origin of Israel and reject what Israel handed down herself, when so much evidence aligns with the Exodus narrative? It is more strenuous to explain away all of this data with alternative explanations than simply to posit one explanation, that Israel began as a nation after an exodus from Egypt. The exodus from Egypt is not a myth. Following a real pattern of evidence, it has been rediscovered, supporting what the Bible reports is an accurate description of how things occurred.